Hey, it's your guy Tyrrell back with the interviews. In today's video, we're going to briefly analyze how Chelsea's 3-4-1-2 destroyed Southampton's tactical setup. So in today's video, first we're going to focus on how both sides look to press, then we'll shift to Chelsea's shape, and lastly we'll focus on the movement from their attacking players. So when we break it all down and we do look at the board, we have Southampton in a 4-4-2 and Chelsea starting in a 3-4-1-2. So one of the key attributes to Chelsea's success here was their pressing in comparison to Southampton's pressing that was unsuccessful throughout the game due to their inability to cope with Chelsea's shape. So when you look at Chelsea's overall shape, you do expect Havertz and Werner to step towards the center backs. The wing backs in Alonso and Loftus-Cheek were pushing higher to close down Livramento and Walker-Peters. And then in that midfield zone, Chelsea do have 3v2, but they also have to be wary of the wider players tucking in. So what we ended up seeing was that for most of the occasion, Werner was pressing the player that was on the ball in one of the center backs. And then you would see Mount and Havertz dropping off deeper to deal with the central midfielders. The same would apply if Havertz was stepping to, let's say, Salisu, and then Werner and Mount were dropping on towards those two central midfielders. And that would allow Kante and Kovacic to track the movement of Armstrong and El Yunusi if they were looking to tuck into central areas. If they were looking to push high into wider positions, that's where Rudiger and Christensen could play a role. And there were occasions where you ended up seeing Havertz and Werner stepping towards the two center backs. And then from there, you would have one of Kante or Kovacic helping Mount with the press. And then you could have the holding midfielder dealing with one of the wider players. And then Rudiger and Christensen can deal with the spare wide player that is left unmarked in those central areas or shifting out into the wider areas. And then in the case, for instance, if Alonso steps to Walker-Peters and Christensen doesn't want to step high to El Yunusi, what you'd see happen here is that if you have Kante and Mount on Ward-Prowse and Romeu, Loftus-Cheek could sit a bit deeper and tuck in to deal with El Yunusi. And if the ball was shifted out to Livramento, then that's when you would see Chelsea adjust with Loftus-Cheek pushing forward. And then one of Kante or Christensen would have to step towards the wide player. So as you could see, in many ways, Chelsea's pressing was effective. They could have both center forwards stepping towards the center backs and then have the midfielders help out with dealing with Ward-Prowse and Romeu as they had Alonso and Loftus-Cheek pushing towards the fullbacks, or they could simply have Werner chasing the player on the ball and then have Havertz and Mount dealing with the Southampton midfielders while Kovacic and Kante deal with anything coming into the central areas, or simply covering in the wide areas with Loftus-Cheek and Alonso pushing higher up the pitch. Southampton, on the other hand, encountered issues, and it was instant from the opening stages, as you could see that Chelsea do have a 3v2 in that zone. You have Adams and Armstrong against Rudiger, Thiago Silva, and Christensen, and that always means that there will be a spare man in that center back role unless Armstrong or El Yunusi step forward to close down the spare man. We witnessed Rudiger and Christensen pushing forward on occasion and looking to play forward passes out and towards the wing backs or into Werner or Havertz dropping off deeper, and they were also capable of finding Mason Mount between the lines, and they served as an outlet to help Chelsea build out of the back. The other option for Southampton here was to have Adams and Armstrong being joined by one of the wider players, but in those situations that often left a gap for Kovacic or Kante to receive the ball in between the gap between the center forward and the wide player, and from there they were able to progress Chelsea's play. In the build-up to Chelsea's opener, you witnessed Christensen splitting El Yunusi and the striker for Kante and focus on the movement of Mount and Loftus-Cheek. Loftus-Cheek shifts laterally towards his left and Mount moves central, and you can see that the Southampton midfield is looking to block off the passing lane into Mount, which frees up space for Loftus-Cheek. Loftus-Cheek carries the ball in towards the final third. You have Havertz to the right, and you have Werner occupying the two center backs with Mount pushing forward. As that play develops, you could witness that 3 out of the 4 defenders are being taken out of the game by Werner and Havertz, and no one's tracking the movement of Mount towards the penalty area. That's where you could see Loftus-Cheek now looking to play the ball in towards Mount, making a free run into the box, and that pulls out Livramento. And when Mount receives the ball, what he does well here is that he chests it down to control it, and he identifies the pressure behind him from Livramento, and he simply flicks the ball into the path of Alonso, who's now unmarked, breaking in towards left half space because of the movement of Mount, Havertz, and Werner. And when he receives the ball ahead of the 6-yard area, it places him in a legitimate goal-scoring position to put Chelsea into the lead. The other alternative that Hasenhüttl turned to was that he had Adams and Armstrong sitting off and blocking off the passing lane into Kovacic and Conte, and that would see more of a hexagonal shape around those central midfielders while Mason Mount was looking to receive the ball between the lines. And if that wasn't the case, you could have Adams and Armstrong stepping towards the ball carrier and the center back closest towards him, and then you could see Ward-Prowse and Romeu stepping forward to deal with Kovacic and Conte. Armstrong and Elyounoussi would be stepping out towards the wing backs, but there were occasions where they would look to step towards the wide center back as well. The problem was that with Romeu and Ward-Prowse pushing forward higher up the pitch, that left more gaps in those central areas for Mason Mount to receive the ball, and it served as an outlet for Werner and Havertz if they could drop deeper to pull out the center backs if they looked to apply tight pressure. In many cases, the best option for Southampton here was probably to cover shadow and have Adams and Armstrong ahead of the center backs and blocking off the passing lane in towards Kovacic and Conte so that the midfield bank could maintain a mid-block and then block off the passing lane in towards Mason Mount. But what we often saw was that one of Romeu or Ward-Prowse would step forward, and it would often be Romeu pushing towards Conte, and then that would see Ward-Prowse sitting deeper to monitor the movement of Mount. However, as the game continued, Chelsea were able to move the ball around quickly amongst their center backs to get the wide center backs to push forward, and from there that would pull out a wide player, and that's where we would see Loftus-Cheek shifting towards the half space zone to serve as a passing outlet. This was a well-designed move and a reoccurring threat for Chelsea against the Southampton backline, because what you saw from Loftus-Cheek was that he was shifting laterally into a narrow half-space position, and from there you would see Havertz making runs out towards the touchline to occupy Livramento. So once Chelsea were able to bypass Elyounoussi, then Loftus-Cheek was free to carry the ball forward in towards the final third. You'd have Havertz pulling away Livramento, and then Mount would be looking to make forward runs in towards the final third, while Werner was either occupying the center backs or occupying Bednarek and Walker-Peters. Once Southampton's pressing diminished, that's where you ended up seeing Chelsea having the freedom to get the ball to Kovacic and Conte. They were capable of finding Mount between the lines or Werner and Havertz dropping off deeper. And then with the wide players pushing higher up the pitch, you'd see Alonso bombing forward down the touchline and looking to peg back Walker-Peters. But there would be situations where you'd have Werner and Havertz occupying the space between the center backs and the full backs and dragging the Southampton backline narrow. And that would allow Alonso to push forward into wider areas and make late runs into the box, whereas like I said with Loftus-Cheek, he was adopting that narrow half space position. Chelsea was getting the width from Havertz, and then he was able to serve as a creative outlet to look to find Mount, Werner, or Alonso breaking in towards the penalty area. In the build-up to Chelsea's second goal, focused on Kovacic splitting the Southampton midfield for Mount between the lines. When he receives the ball and turns, you could see that Werner's occupying Walker-Peters and Salisu, and focus on Loftus-Cheek making the run beyond his marker in Elyounoussi. As that play develops, Loftus-Cheek ends up making a run in towards the right half space, and Mount picks him out as you could see Havertz and Werner occupying both center backs and full backs. That ultimately results in Loftus-Cheek bringing down the ball in right half space, and you could see that there are 3 Southampton players looking to retreat, and from there Loftus-Cheek looks to pull the ball back to Werner, and that ultimately results in the ball falling to Mason Mount, who finishes superbly from distance. In the second half, they attempted to change it by shifting into more of a 4-5-1 by bringing on Diallo. That allowed them to go 3v3 in that midfield zone, but out of possession, they looked like more of a 5-4-1 as Alonso's high positioning pegged back Livramento. The issue that they encountered here in the early stages of that second half that ultimately killed off the game was that when Chelsea were looking to break an attack, one, they were capable of still bypassing that midfield 4 or 5, depending on what Southampton's shape was when Chelsea were looking to create attacks. And then the positioning of Alonso presented several issues for Southampton. So while individual mistakes from the Southampton midfield and backline resulted in Chelsea goals that extended the lead, in that second half, despite the tactical shift, what you ended up witnessing was that Alonso was consistently making runs off Livramento and and pulling Valerie out of position. And from there, Alonso served as a threat in the final third, and it was his runs off Livramento that helped Chelsea get into legitimate goal-scoring positions to kill off the game. So as you can see, Southampton experienced several issues with Chelsea's 3-4-1-2 due to their disjointed pressing, along with an inability to cope with the positioning of Tuchel's wingbacks in wide areas and Mason Mount between the lines.